everybody. I am Carter Wilson, and this is Making It Up, the show where I talk to writers of all sorts of backgrounds and types and personalities and try to figure out why they wanted to go into the world of writing and what was their path and what was their origin story. So it's always fascinating. And at the end of each episode, at the end of each conversation, the other writer and I, we pick a random book from those shelves behind me, and we pick a sentence, and we use that to tell a short story together. So today I talked to Sarah Fine, who is awesome. And she has written a number of books. And she also writes under SF Kosa as well. In fact, that's what she's currently working on, books under SF Kosa. Her new book that just came out just a little bit ago is The Night We Burned, a thriller. And so we have a lot in common. And I've gotten to know her a little bit because we share the same publisher. But her background was actually in clinical psychology. So that has informed a lot of how she's been able to write. But she's written fantasy, she's written romance, all sorts of different books. And now she's kind of writing mystery, thriller, suspense books. But we had a fantastic conversation, and just her introduction into writing didn't come until she was 35. So we're kind of similar like that. And she just went full steam ahead, and her ability to produce books is unbelievable. So her story is really interesting. And at the end, we make up a story based on a sentence from the story of Edgar Sawtelle, which is a great book as well. So anyway, listen, enjoy. This is me talking to Sarah Fine, SF Kosa. How are you?
I'm good.
Long time no see. You and I have had a lot of interaction over the last couple months, having never known each other existed.
Yeah, it's been really nice, actually.
It has been really nice. How are things going? Where are you? Where do you live?
I am on Martha's Vineyard right now.
Oh, well. Summering in the vineyard, are we?
Actually, yes. That is the thing.
So you have a place there, or do you rent for this? And you're there for the summer?
Yeah. So for most of the summer. Yeah.
That's great.
Because we live like in the city. Like, I mean, I live not in Boston proper, but like a block from Boston proper. So it's a pretty urban setting.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to be able to escape sometimes.
What did you do? What did you do last year during the pandemic? Did you spend more time in Martha's Vineyard, or was it a struggle to get out there?
No, we spent as much time as possible. It's possible because of the car ferry, and especially in the off season, you just stay in your car on the ferry.
Yeah.
And you just so it's pretty self-contained. You just drive down, you drive your car on, you stay in the car, and then you drive to the place. And
wow. Yeah. Cause normally you get out of the car and you hang out and whatever.
Right. And it was nice because I live in a particularly rural part of the island.
Okay.
And so, I could go for walks without wearing a mask or seeing anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't really spent any time there. I'm vaguely familiar with that general area. But in my mind, it seems like there's probably great fodder for psychological thrillers. and
that's what I'm writing right now.
Yeah, like in those kind of like pristine, affluent communities where nefarious things are just beneath the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot because there's so much here, like a lot of people choose to be here, including a lot of artists, writers. There's just a lot of sort of different folks doing interesting things, and a fair amount of, interesting happenings and different things. I mean, it's just really, for one small island, there's just a lot happening here of really different types of things. So,
and you get to know, I assume you get to know people over time, and then it becomes kind of an interesting experience, right? Where you have two totally different worlds, but you have maybe friend groups and social groups that are completely disconnected that you spend different amounts of time with. That's got to be kind of cool to be like, oh, now we're going to be next to these guys for 3 months and I haven't talked to them in forever.
That's right. It is nice. I mean, we're sort of newer to this. Like this isn't a place I've been coming for years and years.
Okay.
So I feel like I'm still very entranced with it. And of course, the first thing I do is think of like, oh, this is a great setting for my next book.
Totally. Yeah, there's kind of I'm sure maybe a Great Gatsby-esque kind of a vibe to the whole thing. And that's my imagination, probably.
I mean, we're not quite in that echelon.
But that echelon's probably there.
Oh my goodness, yes. But it's closer to Edgar Town. We're like all the way on the other side. We're up island over here.
Okay. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in a lot of different places, actually. My family moved around a lot. So when I say I'm from Indiana, I'm not really. Like that's where I spent my junior high and high school years, which were pretty formative.
Sure.
But until that point, I was born in California. We moved to Maryland, down to Texas, up to Canada, back to Maryland, and then to Indiana.
Was that through the nature of your parents' work, or what was?
Yeah, first my dad was in the Navy, and then he was in graduate school, and then he was looking for a tenure track position, which took a few years. So
to a tenure to do what?
He was before he retired, a mechanical engineering professor.
Oh, okay. Where did he teach?
He taught at Rose Holman Institute of Technology was where he had his decades-long career.
Wow.
And that's in Terre Haute, Indiana.
Okay.
So that's when we moved there when I was around 12.
And did your mom work or no?
Yeah, my mom was trained as a nurse, and then she decided to go back to graduate school, which she did at the University of Texas, which is where my family is originally from, is Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So she went back there and got her PhD, and then came back to Indiana and was a professor of nursing for many years.
All right. So you come from a practical academic background with family.
Yeah.
And do you have siblings or?
Observations. Yeah, I do. I have 2 younger sisters.
Okay. So was teaching of any kind of any interest to you when you were growing up, or did that inform you at all, the fact that both your parents were teaching?
Well, my mom didn't really become like a professor until after I had left home.
Okay, got it.
She was still working, I think, as a nurse when I was in high school. She's done so many different things over the years. She's always got something going. She is like a busy person. In terms of my own expectations, I think I was socialized to my parents expected me to go to graduate school for something.
Right.
And because they actually said, they were like, it's not so much where you go to college, Sarah, it's where you go to graduate school, and specifically who your advisor is. So it was just like this, that just paints a picture of expectation in terms of, what I would do, although they never pressured me to do anything specific.
Right. And in their world, there was no such thing as just a bachelor's degree and you go out and you work. There was everything was like at high, even higher education level, I think.
Yeah, and it wasn't because nobody in my family is like particularly affluent but education was like really important. I think one thing that's really unusual about my background is that, like, for example, all 4 of my grandparents had graduate degrees.
Oh, wow.
Including both my grandmothers. And my mom's mom was a professor of theater for many, many years. So they were, educated. And then I think, the generation before that were school teachers. So there is like this element of education is the thing we do.
And were in your formative years in Indiana, were you feeling any kind of pull towards anything? Like, well, I know I got to go to graduate school. So what does that mean? Because I know you ended up becoming a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
But was that in your mind at all?
I headed off to college thinking I was going to be like a surgeon or something. I had some idea in my head. I took a lot of science and chemistry and in high school. And so I thought I was going to go to medical school, but then I got to college, started taking, I think I made it to organic chemistry.
Oh, that's brutal.
I was just like, I was like, I hate this.
Yeah.
I hate this. I hate studying for it. It would just, I have friends who just like, that was like the thing that turned them on to something.
I've heard it's just awful.
Well, the moment things went 3D, like I'm not great spatially. And so with organic chemistry, there's all this, you're looking at these molecules and compounds and these, like, it became like a lot of a diagram, like focused. I was like, I can't, like my brain can't twist things that way. And
yeah,
I just stopped enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I went to the professor and I was like, because he wanted to know why I had done so poorly on that last test. And I was like, I hate this. I absolutely hate it. He was like, so here's what you should do. Take this class, pass, fail, and find a new major. And I was like, yeah, I know.
Wow. That was pretty. Yeah. My brain doesn't work like that. My sister's brain works like that. She has a PhD in chemistry. And my father was, an electrical engineer. And I'm just not. I was always okay with math, but when it came to like chemistry or biology, I hated it. There was just nothing interesting to me at all about it. So I didn't go that route at all. So you changed your major.
I did. It took me a while to find psychology, but once I did, that was it, because I did like the analytical piece of science. I like the idea of investigating a thing, designing some way to assess what's actually going on, getting some results and, going from there. I liked that piece of it. So social science was much more my thing, as it turned out. I just had to figure it out.
And then that obviously necessitated graduate work. And then, so what did that manifest itself into?
Well, I actually didn't plan to be a clinical psychologist. I just knew I was like, okay, I want to be a psychologist. And I actually, I think I just did some research and I thought, clinical psychology seems like, the most interesting, fascinating thing.
Right.
It also happened to be very competitive. And I have to be honest, like that is a thing. I was like, here's the thing. Like I like quiet competitions where I can do the best I can and see how well I did, which came into my, as I started investigating writing as the thing I wanted to do. But so I didn't actually get into clinical psychology because this is going to sound terrible, because I was so eager to help people. Mm-hmm. That came later.
Right.
But at first I was just like, this is really fascinating stuff.
You were more interested in how the brain works and how behaviors can be tied to, different stimulus and stimuli and things like that, rather than I want to hear your problems all day long.
Well, it wasn't that it was just that I didn't think I was that kind of person.
Right.
I gravitated towards the science of it and thought of myself more in that way. And went to a very sort of science and research oriented graduate school. And it wasn't, I just, as I carved different experiences out, I ended up in a place I didn't really expect to be, which is I specialized in very young children. So my specialty is actually in working with children or families of children under the age of 6.
Oh, wow.
Because I just ended up so fascinating with small humans and how they figure the world out.
Yeah. But you were working with them as a therapist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my research is also with, kids under 12. That was the research I did. My dissertation is on emotion understanding and, things like that. But my clinical work, I sort of slowly carved out that specialty and got more and more focused on it as the years progressed.
So that's a very specific and a very time consuming occupation that requires, I would imagine, tremendous focus and probably a lot of empathy. But how does that start to dovetail with, hey, I want to write sci-fi urban fantasy books?
Oh gosh. Well, that was a really sudden thing. I think it's actually, I don't know all of your like sort of genesis as a writer, but I have to say that what you've said sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was already, I was out of postdoc. I was into, this career. I was, doing a lot of supervision and psychological assessments. And, so I was doing my psychology thing, but I don't know where, I was around 35.
Okay.
And I was reading a lot because reading had always been my escape.
And was that something since childhood? You were always like a
Absolutely.
big reader?
Yeah. I grew up in a house full of books. And like my parents actually just had a room that was very, very messy, but just like clogged with books. And so I would creep in and, grab things off the shelf because we didn't have cable and, it's rural Indiana. A lot of different forms of distraction.
No devices. The books were the devices.
I'm old enough that there was no internet at that time. And so, yes, I was always a big reader, and I liked, I read a variety of things, but at the time I was reading a lot of romance. And I think I had a very naive thought, which was like, well, this doesn't seem so hard. What if I could do that? Well, that was very foolish, but it got me going. Like it was enough. That foolishness was enough to have me think like, oh, what if I could do this? And so I sat down. It was like the night of, it was, a day or two after my 35th birthday. And I started writing. And a month later I had written a book.
Wow. So did you have an idea in mind? Because it sounds like you were, and it's funny because I've talked to a decent amount of people, and there's definitely a camp where that writing motivation came from, I can do this. Like reading something like, I can do this. And that's
very comforting.
There's a lot of people who are like that. And it's not like I have an idea that it just has to get out. It's like, this book I'm reading kind of blows and I could totally do better than this. Or like, I want to see if I can do it rather than like, I've got this story.
Yeah. So I've always, I think, had sort of an active, like, fantasy life, maybe. Like I remember, when I was a teenager, I would like actually look forward to going to sleep at night because I had these really wild dreams that I found much more interesting than my reality. And so I've always, had an active imagination and have been drawn to sort of mentally, that's probably how I cope in some ways, sort of mentally escape a little bit into like a different realm sometimes with my thoughts. And so as I thought about wanting to do this, I actually, like a few months earlier, I had sort of thought, well, maybe I could write something. And I started writing something about a psychologist.
Yeah.
And a few pages in, I was like, I can't do this. This is really boring. This is incredibly boring. It got really technical really fast, and it's just not interesting to read. So I just tossed that out, and I was like, well, and then, like a few months later, I can't remember how I came up with the idea, but I started to come up with an idea, and I thought I could write this into a book. But that just set off this cascading process in my brain, such that I would be commuting to work in the morning and just churning on this idea, just obsessing about it. And then I put it aside and I do my, work for the day, which is pretty absorbing. But then on the commute home, I'd be back to my churning. And then I'd get home and I'd be writing, or I'd get up at 3 a.m. and be writing. It was a little bit, I don't want to say manic, because clinically I mean, it wasn't that, but it was this very frenetic period.
But it sounds like you're the type of person because, and I think there's a lot of parallels between our two stories. It sounds like you're maybe the type of person who's like, okay, I'm going to give myself this challenge. And come hell or high water, this challenge is going to be met, whether it's training for a marathon or whatever. It's like, I'm going to get up at 3 a.m. and run a few miles because now it's in my head that I'm going to do this.
Well, and it became rapidly, now these characters are in my head,
right,
and I'm crazy about them. Like, I'm so fascinated with what they're doing. I cannot wait to write this scene. I would wake up because I couldn't get back to sleep because I was imagining a scene. So it really was not just like, I want to write a book. It started that way, but it rapidly became, I have to write this story.
I want to see where it goes. It sounds like you're not outlining, right? You're just like, kind of like, I can't wait to figure out where it goes next kind of a thing.
Not at that point, although I did have like scenes that I really wanted to write. And
Sure.
I usually write in a very linear fashion.
Me too.
But at that point, that first book, I was like, could not wait to write a certain scene. So I just wrote it. And then I wrote to it. And then of course it changed. And then I wrote, so that's my first book I wrote in a very different way than I ended up writing much later.
And it's the other thing that's kind of a parallel, I think, between us is I was 33 when I started writing, but having zero background in creative writing. However, I had a very heavy background in my case, in business writing. And I'm sure the amount of writing you've had to do over the years has been tremendous. And that builds a muscle that's not the exact same one as writing creatively, but it's like, it's not so intimidating to think like writing 2,000 words is going to take me a year and a half. Because I think for people who don't come out of that background, all of a sudden trying to write a book, just it's an inch by inch struggle to get through sometimes. And probably for us, at least, the physical act of completing sentences and creating a storyline that has that has some kind of arc to it wasn't terribly difficult.
No, I have always been, from like toddlerhood, an intensely verbal human. It's just the way I process the world. I would just say, I'm entirely made of words. I have no spatial ability. But
That's a great sentence.
That's just all I've got. But also, you're absolutely right. I mean, I have never, to this day, taken a creative writing course. I never did.
Me neither. Yeah.
I didn't. I never thought of myself as particularly creative or an artistic or creative person. I thought, I'm more of a scientific person.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. Like, I had written articles, grants, reports, papers. A psychological evaluation is, it's probably like 6,000 or 7,000 words.
Right.
So, and in graduate school, just as a survival mechanism, I developed the ability to type really quickly.
Yeah.
I'm a very fast typer. So I think that those things, you're absolutely right, like lower the bar or that threshold so it's easier to step over into writing a longer form project.
Right. So you're writing this book, or you've written this book. You're in your mid-30s. Are you married at the time?
I was.
Yeah. So, and were you kind of like, because in my story, I didn't tell anybody I was writing. I was completely embarrassed by it, and not even my wife at the time, because I'm like, what if I don't finish it? I don't want to be that person who's like telling everyone I'm writing a book, and then I get 10 pages into it. Were you telling people that you were doing all this?
No. I was totally internally focused. Like, I was, fun to actually kind of a funny extent. Because by the end I was like, well, nobody's ever done this before. I had this weird idea, like I was special in some way, when like thousands and thousands of people do this every year for the first time. but yeah, no, I didn't tell anybody until I was finished, which actually, I mean, it
including your husband.
Long. No, but I mean, that was part of the reason I think I was just diving into writing, was sort of like an escape and coping for that situation. So I was just like pouring all my energy into those words.
Yeah.
It wasn't working or parenting. You know, I had 2 little kids at home.
Yeah. It's wow. It's funny. It's so similar, but I, you know, in my experience, and I knew, I'm like, okay, this first manuscript, I have zero context for this. You know, even though I was a decent reader, I'm like, I think it sucks, but it's something. But it was enough to give me that sense of like, hey, maybe this is something I should be paying attention to. You know, this is
a rational way of thinking about it.
Well, it's like the fact that you do something that's pretty hard to do, and it comes out of nowhere, kind of, you know, is a light in your head saying like, hey, maybe this is what you're meant to do. Maybe you should listen to this. That's what the moment was for me. I'm like, I'm like, I can learn how to do it better. But the fact that I did it, I think is meaningful. Did you have that sense?
So I was stunned when I had done. It's like you run a race and you realize like you've won somehow. Right. You've left everybody in the dirt. Not right. that.
Well, what you did is you ran a marathon without training. Is what you did.
Yes. It was basically. I was just like, oh my gosh! 4 weeks later, like here I have this completed thing.
Right.
What do I do now?
Right.
And so I think the first thing I did was I gave it to my parents. And I was like, parents, I am so special. I have written a book. What do you think? And they were like, you are indeed so special. Perhaps you should think about getting this published. And I was like, yes, maybe I should. So I did some internet research.
Of course.
How does one get a publisher?
The internet tells you to find an agent.
Yeah, that's right. To find an agent. And I was like, oh, well, that's no problem.
How do I do that?
I researched how to write a query letter. I wrote what I believe to be an amazing query letter. Sent it off, expecting immediate, you know, how the glow is still there. And then, of course, immediately started to get like rejections left and right. I was like, what is happening here? And so I've always been an information seeker.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, wait, let me take a few steps back and figure this out. And so I rapidly discovered the online writing community.
Yep.
Got myself my very first beta reader for real, not my parents.
Right.
And who started giving me some feedback. And I was like, ooh, okay, maybe this isn't the perfect masterpiece that I believe it to be. And between that and the rejections, I was like, so I finished the book. I started writing in October. I finished by the end of November. I started querying in December and writing like a sequel, which I had like 80,000 words of by the end of
Wow.
I was just like in this mode of like, wow, I have a new power. I have developed superpower.
Wow. That's great.
And I was like in this bubble. And, but after about 30 query rejections, I started looking at my work a little bit more like, maybe this isn't good enough.
Yeah.
And then once I started looking at it, I was like, no, it's definitely not good enough.
The bubble burst a little bit.
Well, it was more of a like, it was interesting because I wasn't crushed. I didn't.
Right.
So
you were looking at it analytically.
I guess I was. And I mean, writing for me is still very emotional. It was then even more so. I was so wrapped up in these characters and everything. But I am also very intellectually fickle in that once I get onto a new idea, the sting of having the old idea kind of fail or not get what I was hoping for, it kind of fades. And that's how I've coped with rejection my entire writing career. Is I'm like, well, I'm already in love with a new thing. So you can reject me all you want.
Right.
Because I'm already in love with something else.
But that's That's really interesting, because I think that's absolutely true. Because first of all, rejection is, a tremendous part of any writer's journey, and it's a helpful part of it. I talk all the time about the power of being rejected, and if you do have that thick skin, you can look and like, well, why are they rejecting me? Oh, they're all saying the same thing. Maybe I should be listening to that.
It's super
Because
helpful.
for those of us who've never taken creative writing classes and are taking years to find our voices, having those professional criticisms are key, because that helps inform who we are as writers. And I think we're also similar in the sense of like, I start falling in love with my next idea, and then that seed blossoms, and there's no turning back. And
Yeah, it's dangerous.
it is. And that's why I write standalones, because I'm so interested in just entirely different stories. And you made a really interesting comment about, writing being emotional. I think that's really important, because for me, it's not so much about like, I can't wait to, write this scene about, this car chase. I can't wait to feel this person's emotion as they're going through this experience. And, it'll get to the point where, I will cry sometimes when I'm writing, and I'm like, this is powerful to me. I think this works.
Yeah.
And the emotion of writing, I think, is more important than the plotting or the dialogue. It's like, where is the emotion in here? Because that's where your characters come out.
Manage to capture it. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that emotion carried me for a number of years. I just had this weird, like I dropped that book, I wrote another one, and that one became my debut novel. But like, even while I was querying it, I was writing something else, and like then ended up querying with two things. Like I just was like a maniac for a few years.
Yeah.
Because I was so emotionally engaged, but I would get a new idea and I would just run with it.
Right. Well, you're finding your footing, right? Because it takes so much time not only to develop a voice, but to develop what's my system, and that system might be chaotic, but after a while, what works for you as a writer, whether it's when you write during the day or how much you write, or that
until
kind
it
of a thing.
changes. So for me, I'm going through, like the last few years, I've gone through this huge change in my writing and process, because for years, what worked for me was that frenzied pace. I mean, it was very strange. Like I started writing at the end of 2009. I got an agent in 2010, my first book deal in the middle of 2011, and my first book came out in 2012. But by the time that book came out, I had 3 different contracts with 3 different publishers to do different things. Like there was a co-authored project, and there was another project, and there's an ongoing series. I got all this like stuff happening. And like by the time 2015 rolled around, I had 5 books come out that year.
Wow.
And I think, I've gone through this huge, like in the last 10 years, my life has changed a lot.
Sure.
So I think between all of those things, I think, to be perfectly honest, the things that were working then for me, which was this like super intense, emotional, like sort of, and I would write with blocks of time, because I can't, on days that I do psychology work, I don't have any energy left to write.
Right.
I'm tapped out.
I'm sure.
Like focused, and then I just need to rest and disconnect. But so on my free days, I would just like write 8,000 words.
Oh my goodness.
And I told you, really fast. But I don't have your more measured hour a day system.
Well, I can type fast, but I got to make sure those words are in my head first. I don't know if I have 8,000 words in my head in a sitting.
I would just like, I used to do that, but I don't really do that anymore. And
do you think you were seeking some kind of stability over time?
I think I was just seeking, like, for me, it was, at first it was like this escape, and I loved it. But then it became like a job where I had a whole bunch of different contracts I needed to fulfill. And I was still enjoying it, but I finally got to the point where I was like, I gotta slow down. This isn't as much fun. It's feeling more like an obligation.
And it's exhausting. It's hard work. Like, it's not like,
It goes in the work.
yeah. I mean, because you're having to produce creative content is so mentally taxing that sometimes I'll look back on it and be like, I can't believe I did all that. I barely remember that happening, but I remember being very tired at the end of it.
I've read a lot of, I'll go back every once in a while. If somebody recalls like something from my book, and I'll go back and look at it and I'll be like, I do not remember writing this.
Totally. I'll forget characters' names.
Idea. I'll be like, whoa, did I actually write that?
That's pretty messed up.
Okay. That's weird, but like, I don't have any memory of doing it because you just, when you're in that mode, it
so
flows.
now you're, well, and the other thing about you is you've written a lot of different types of fiction.
Yeah.
But you're now more measured in how you approach your day-to-day writing.
Yes. Well, interestingly, like in 2015, I actually left psychology for a few years because I had so many books and it was like overwhelming. I also, had a kid diagnosed with a serious medical condition and like there was just a lot going on in my life. And I was like, I can't do all of this with all of these commitments. I can't do this other job well. Because at the time I was running a large program and supervising a lot of people and I had been pulling back and back and back. So I was like, I just can't. And I thought at the time, oh, I'll be able to write maybe 10 books a year because, I've written so many while I was doing this stuff. And what I found out is actually
it stresses me out.
Well, it's ridiculous. I can be ridiculous, obviously, but I realized very rapidly that that's just not the way it works.
Yeah.
When you have all the time in the world to write, for me, I write less.
Yeah.
Not more.
Because you need almost that pressure of like, you've got an hour and a half, be as productive as possible because this is the only time you have. I
think that intensity for me, I've always been motivated by a little bit of, when I have endless time, I fill it with endless nonsense. And when I have limited time, I just buckle down and do
I think that's pretty common for people.
Yeah, it's definitely not unusual. I've definitely heard a lot of people say that, but that's sort of, between that and like, it's interesting. I think that this is probably true for most people, at least I hope I'm not the only one. I definitely, through my writing and my books or whatever's catching my interest, it's definitely a signal of something that's going on in my life, like whatever I'm processing, however peripherally, it'll come out in my writing in terms of what is interesting to me at the time.
Yeah.
So for many years, I wrote intensely romantic books. And then I basically lost interest in writing romantic books.
Yeah.
Why? Because I met my now husband and, I have like a sort of a different interest. I'm like, I have my romance. I'll go do mystery or, something that fulfills a different need.
Yeah. Is that a challenge though, in terms of, I mean, I know you write under a couple different names, but do you find that as a challenge as like, well, my publisher wants me to stay in this lane, but now all of a sudden I'm shifting to something else?
I don't know. I think I've had sort of a scattered career, and throughout it, it has always been dictated by what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And even if that means like, having a fond farewell with a publisher, because I just want to do something different.
Right.
that's just kind of how it is.
And that's great because, and again, a similarity is we both kind of write for ourselves and just kind of hope that, there's a market for what we're writing. I've gravitated towards thrillers over time for sure. But when I think of a story, I'm not thinking about the audience. I'm thinking about like, I'm just intensely interested in it. And I want to see what happens next. And do you, because for people listening or watching to this, especially aspiring writers, it almost sounds like wow, she just started doing it. And then she had multiple book deals going on. And I will say that is pretty unique as a writer's experience. The level of success you've had in terms of getting things published has been tremendous. However, at the time, I'm sure to your point, it felt very chaotic and deadlines and all. But have you had the opportunity to like step back and just be like, holy shit, this is pretty amazing that I've accomplished, that I've actually had these many books, of interest to publishers, coming from no background at all in writing, creative writing. I mean, are you able to be grateful for what you've accomplished?
So I think those are different questions. Like I'm grateful that I've had this opportunity. The opportunities I have had. I'm not entirely satisfied with what I've accomplished. I'm always like, well, what should I be doing next? What should I be doing? Especially as I've decided to like pull back, slow down. And to be truthful right now, my only focus is on reconnecting with my writing and that passion that I felt. Mm-hmm. That's really all I care about. Like, that's my job of this year, is to do that. Because I realized, like, I just got into this, like, you can be moving at a pace where you don't have time to process.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm focused on. In terms of like looking at my career, it's usually takes someone else to point it out for me to think about it.
Me too.
Like my husband will say, he's like, Sarah, when I'll express some anxiety, he's like, you've had all of these other books published. Why are you even like expressing anxiety about this? And I'm like, well, it's, things change. And
right.
he's like, oh my goodness. Like,
yeah.
Stop. So when you get that reality check from someone who's looking at you from the outside, that's very helpful. And I have, other writer friends who, will sort of reminisce, because we met each other through my friend Lydia Kang, who writes all sorts of books. She also has written in a bunch of different genres, but is right now doing like historical medical mysteries.
Yeah.
Because she's a physician. And so we connected, so we will reflect together on like, isn't this interesting that we are doing this thing?
Right.
Not what we trained to do.
Right. And so few people who start that thing ever get anywhere commercially with it. I mean, it's really like pretty astounding, the odds of actually getting published by a legit publisher. So yeah, but I'm the same way. I need people to point that out to me too. I remember a few years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I was telling somebody, at a cocktail party, I'm like, I don't even call myself, I don't tell people I'm a writer, like, because I don't feel like a writer. And they're like, you've had 4 books published. I'm like, well, I know, but still, I'm.
It took me years.
Yeah, totally.
But it was particularly weird when I had stepped away from my psychology job and I was writing, and I'm like, what am I now? Like,
how do I define myself?
How do I even, and I remember going to my husband's like work, like holiday party.
Yeah.
And people would ask me, they look at you like, well, what are you here for? And I'm like, I think over the course of that night, I probably said 4 different things. I was like, one person I said I was a psychologist. One person I said I was in publishing.
I'm a rodeo clown,
I was just saying all these different, I'm in publishing. Am I in publishing? Like, I just write books. I'm not in publishing. It makes me sound like I'm an editor or something. So I was so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That I kept saying different things. I was like, these people are going to think I'm just making stuff up. That I'm not actually any of these things. That there was some piece of truth in that. It just never felt comfortable.
Right.
So now I still don't really know.
Yeah. We never know. Well, look, as we begin to wrap up here, I'm going to help you reconnect with that passion of writing, and we're going to do a little bit of storytelling.
Yeah, I'm a slow processor, so I'm hoping I can do this. But...
Well, that's okay. That's why this isn't live, and that's why we can edit it down. I have a guy who does my guy who does all my editing, like the storytelling part. When it comes out, I'm like, oh, these people are lightning quick because we've edited out all the gaps and the ums, and I don't know how to do this, but it actually flows really well, and it'll be short, maybe just a couple minutes. But I've already picked out 3 books. I'm going to have you choose one of them.
Oh my, okay.
The Story of Edgar Sawtelle, which is a tremendous book that I didn't know anything about and that I picked up, I think, at a thrift shop, and I read. Okay. Stephen King's The Shining.
Oh my.
Or Slaughterhouse 5.
Oh gosh. Well, I'll go with the one I haven't read. So Edgar
Sawtelle. Okay, so pick a page number between 1 and 550.
327.
Okay. And then a sentence between, let's say, 1 and 5.
What?
Oh, sorry. Just pick a sentence between 1 and 5.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were like, let me see. 3.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read the sentence, and then just give me however much you want, sentence or 2, and I'll do a couple, and then after a couple minutes, I'll call it a day. Okay. Together, they ran down the slope behind the barn until they reached the rock pile, and there Edgar sat, senseless, while the dogs milled about.
He couldn't believe they had actually done it. They'd left the body behind and should probably go back to retrieve it. But right now he just needed to catch his breath.
Edgar sat on the rock, felt the light breeze licking his face, and he looked down at his hands. He'd torn a nail, and there was blood all the way up to his forearms. He was still out of breath, and then Jim came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "What do you want to do now?"
Edgar still wasn't sure if the blood was his or not. He rubbed at his fingertips, and it came off in little flakes. It was already dry, even though he was sure it had only been a minute or 2. He turned to look over his shoulder at Jim and said, "I'm not sure I can do this."
Jim nodded, grunted, I get it. Edgar kept looking at him, and then he glanced back to the body, and he said out loud, but mostly to himself, "I don't quite know what happened." Then he turned to Jim and said, "It was you, right? Tell me you're the one who did it. Tell me I didn't have anything to do with this. I don't remember."
Jim let out a sad sort of laughter, and he stepped back. Edgar pushed himself up from the ground and looked back up the slope. "You're really not sure?" Jim said. "Because I think you know." Edgar shook his head, even though he did know. He just couldn't face it quite yet.
And with that, Edgar walked off on his own, leaving Jim behind. And he didn't walk towards the body because he didn't want to see that anymore. If he didn't look at it, it wouldn't be real. Instead, he walked across the high grasses, which were dry and brittle, scraping against his bare legs. And he walked to the edge of the ravine, where he looked down. It was a bit of a drop, maybe a big drop, and he stood at the edge.
He closed his eyes and swayed in a sudden breeze. Behind him, he could hear the crunch of Jim's footsteps. And all he could hope was that Jim was headed back up to clean up the mess and not back down to try to convince Edgar to come back, because he wasn't ever going back. He was sure of that now.
I think we call it there. That was great. I could really visualize that. I could really see it was very almost kind of Mice and Minish a little bit. And that's kind of what I had in my mind. That was fun.
That was fun.
There was no big pauses there. You see, you're getting the passion back. You're reconnecting with your writing.
That's right.
You can dedicate your next book to me.
No problem. I'm on chapter 5, so we'll see how long it takes me. I'm much slower than I used to be.
Awesome. Well, it was great. We've talked a few times and you've interviewed me, and it was nice to hear your story. And it's a fascinating one and pretty different than a lot of people I've talked to. And you should be grateful because you've had a tremendous amount of success, but I know that I'm the other person who's now telling you this, so you can have that in your...
Well, that I'm actually grateful for. I'm grateful to hear those perspectives because it's so easy to get lost in your own head, right?
100%. So
that's what we do.
Well, listen, great talking to you and enjoy the rest of your week. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for this.
Take care. Bye. So this is my conversation with Sarah Fine, who also writes as SF Kosa. I really enjoyed our conversation. We've talked a few times over the last several months. She actually interviewed me for a show she's doing, and as part of my book launch. So we've gotten to know each other pretty well. And I just think she's a fascinating person and a hell of a great writer. If you want to find out more about Sarah, you can just go to sarahfinebooks.com. And if you want to know more about me or subscribe to my newsletter, you can just go to carterwilson.com. In the meantime, I appreciate you listening or watching this episode of Making It Up. There will be more soon. Take care.